Okay, great. Well, I suppose I'll just dive in. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar, Celebrating Traditional Medicine and Spiritual Beliefs and Practices. We're going to hear from our own co-director, Sean Bear, and a member of our advisory council, Ray Daw. Before I pass it over to them, I just need to mention this webinar as part of our ongoing TA to tribal opioid response grantees is supported by a grant from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And the content of this event is the creation of the presenters, and the opinions don't necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, Human Health and Services, or the TOR TA Center. Today we're going to be hearing from Ray Daw and Sean Bear. And Ray, is there anything you'd like to say about yourself?
For my Navajo relatives who are probably the audience, I need to introduce my clans. I am Kia'ani from the Towering House people. My father's clans are Tlazatlana or Minigoat people. And my maternal grandfathers are Tsidnachini Blackstreet people. My paternal grandfathers are Twitachini or Bitterwater people, and I'm originally from Hawk, Arizona. My Tohe, that's where my maternal roots are, as well as my family. So I needed to go through that process as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have our co-director, Sean Bear, on the line.
Yeah, the only thing is I'd like to say is my Indian name is Kiukuk. I'm from the Bear Clan and from the Meskwaki tribe in Tame, Iowa.
Thanks, Sean. And before we get started, we also want to take a moment to start with acknowledgements. I think our own Dr. Kathy Tomlin is going to tell you a bit.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. We would like to take this time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the Indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken over and inhabited. Past and present, we want to honor the land itself and the people who have stewarded throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to forever learn how to be better stewards of these lands through action, advocacy, support, and education. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of Native American territories, and we respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. While injustices are still being committed against Indigenous people on Turtle Island, today we say thank you to those who stand with Indigenous peoples and acknowledge that land reparations must be made to allow healing for our Indigenous peoples and to Mother Earth herself. A message from our Meskwaki friends, Ella, Keely, and Sean.
Thanks, Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also going to stop sharing for just a moment so that you can bring up your slide.
Okay. What we'd like to do is read a poem for one of our speakers, Sean. This is a poem that he recently wrote at the beginning of this fall. And the picture up above, there's a little bit, if you look really hard, there's a little bit of pale blue up there, but it represents the various colors of life. Colors can be a wonderful thing in defining, not just in nature, but the colors within and of spirit. Just as in dreams we may have, so too does color carry multiple meanings of the same. Red is of power and hatred, yet blood may foresee death. The eyes of hatred may carry dangers, yet bouncers carry them back. Blue is of a mere sight and of sadness, yet skies may be dark of night. The brightness protects and may carry thunders and lightning. Black has the potential to hide goodness, yet an abyss makes for a hard fall. The unknown may be hard to navigate, and home is just a whisper away. White is cold as ice, yet even a blizzard is hidden in snow. Knowledge of old holds the secrets and ancient stories buried in time. Yellow is of dawning breath who walks the earth, yet too much sun may melt even rock. Healing comes in many ways from nature, medicines, and the creator. Green is the balance of life, yet even green snakes carry a danger. Female power is hidden in the mother who awaits the return of her children. Sean Bear,
Mm.
2021.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand it over to Sean and Ray. I can pull up your PowerPoint here.
Mhm.
And I think this is where we left off.
Okay, so here to honor Native American Heritage Month. What you see here, we'll be talking a little bit about some of these, but the hammock, when people first came across, they'd see natives sleeping in hammocks above the ground. Some of the different foods that indigenous peoples bring, of course, like pumpkins and stuff like that came from some of the look at indigenous knowledge of medicines and stuff like that, how much it's brought to the medical society and pharmaceuticals and things like that. But also many forget that when the flag was first risen or raised, it was there was a Native American in there. And so that's something to be mindful of. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so first of all, we're going to get into agricultural practices, but we really wanted to kind of make the note as like a Native American Heritage Month, and it's about being proud of who we are, and remembering that our heritage is part of who we are. So it's, you know, I didn't want to make anything like saying, oh, this is all this things that's happened to us in the world, but are in history, because we're supposed to be kind of being mindful of the things that make us who we are. And like with agricultural practices, of course, many of them are seasonal, among other practices. Looking at how crop rotation today came from many of the practices that natives were utilizing before, and with the Three Sisters growing corn, beans, and squash together. So beans automatically replenishes the earth, nitrogen. The squash kind of covers the ground, so the weeds don't come bearing up. And the corn, of course, is something that is very cherished among many of the tribes. And when they first came across, they found pumpkins and sweet apples. From Central America, maize, you know, of course, with the corn, and papaya and chocolate. I mean, they have even found chocolate up in, I think, New Mexico, stuff like that. With the ceremonies, with the South American came from the avocado and pineapple. So we want to be mindful of all the people too that were on this whole continent.
Yeah, I think one of the concepts that gets lost, that has gotten lost over time, is that trading was very extensive. And that's how it is that corn in and of itself was grown all the way down in what is now South America, and is all the way up to to northern states. And the native people, and that didn't occur by accident. It's through extensive trading across the long trading routes that were there, that corn was basically known and then used by almost all the tribes in the continent. And and the same holds true for beans and squash. You know, they're extensively traded and used, and tribes were able to adapt. Corn, there are a lot of varieties of corn, for example, that developed over time. And so our tribal people were pretty adept at getting corn in and of itself, and then creating hybrids from which fit the environment and the lands that they lived in. So and so when we talk about agriculture, I look at it as part of the impact of a very extensive trading system, like Sean said. That trading system that existed went all the way from South America all the way up north, a real vertical trading system. In the European, Asian countries, that trading system was very vertical like this. Here it was more horizontal, and here it was very vertical. So we knew, for example, the process of growing pumpkin, as well as the people further south. And one of the celebrations we have this month, and is acknowledging that we all shared from each other ways of living that created a very nice system. The other thing is that there was an abundance of agricultural products in the environment. You know, wild rice, for example, wasn't cultivated the way we think of agriculture, but we think of agriculture in terms of planting seeds and growing stuff. But agriculture from many tribal perspectives was a process of taking care of those plants that were already there, like berries, pinon trees, wild rice up north, and many of the greens that grew in our countryside, tobacco, for example, was cultivated, but from seeds. But a lot of the agriculture that was used in the Native American countries system were indigenous to those areas, and then once again traded up and down the countryside. Tribes that had a lot of that harvested buffalo, for example, would take buffalo and trade with those tribes that gathered heavily or grew plants as a way to supplement their diet. So that's the significance of the agricultural practices that we are aware of right now.
I like you with the,
Go ahead.
I liked how you talked about with the east and west and north and south, because that is it's it's very prophetic, really, because long before they started talking about the seventh or eighth fire prophecies, there was warnings about things and which things came in which directions of how things would come. Even like the buildings in Cahokia with Illinois near St. Louis, those they were built much like the ones down in Mexico and South America.
Mm-hmm.
Slide. Would you like to start, Ray?
Go ahead, Sean.
Okay, so livestock. In a sense, we didn't really have livestock. Of course, it came later on with sheep in the Southwest, but animals were allowed to live their own normal life and stuff in their own environments. Dogs you can look at as domesticated wolves. Cats you can look at as domesticated wildcats, in the sense that they made in like Egypt and things like that. It derived from a wild mouflon. They were a mountain sheep. They were very dark. And later on, since the hair was so dark, when they first started to domesticate these and make them more into sheep, what we see today, they had to dye them a really light color in order to dye them another color for clothing and stuff like that. So over time, sheep became white. Cows derived from wild cows, of course. But here, buffalo and elk, etc., they roam free. They were hunted. So, along with even smaller ones like squirrels and rabbits, things like that. Also, there are some information that rabbits also were in China, things like that.
In addition, Sean, let me include that one people that domesticated a animal were the Inca. They domesticated the llama, and because of the mountains, they needed to do that, I think, to help them carry packs. So the process of domestication wasn't unknown to folks. Well, one of the traps we fall into from a Euro-American mindset is that domestication is vital to survival and quote unquote civilization. And that's not true. There were millions of buffalo roaming most of North America up into Alaska, millions. And so because there were an abundance of buffalo across the Northern American countryside from the Southwest all the way to Alaska, there was little need to domesticate buffalo, for example, or even deer. There was an abundance of wildlife. There was little need to domesticate it. And so that influences how Native people historically had that close relationship with animals and understood the value of basically taking care of what was out there. Native, in many of our songs and prayers that we have, very traditionally, are prayers and songs that include how we are responsible to the four-legged and the winged relatives that we have around us, to be able to have that relationship with them that is good for them and good for us, and how it is that in many of our ways we include a whole variety of animals and in our ways of blessing each other, talking with each other, relating to each other. My people, for example, in Navajo, we don't consume bear because they're so specially respected by us. Other people do. So that's the thing about livestock. I think that is, for me, from my point of view, important for us to realize is that when we think of livestock, we got to think outside of that box of domesticating and putting and having animals in pens so that we can have food and sustenance to live on. There's no need to pen animals when they're in great abundance, is my point here. And many of the tribes in the Americas understood that, I think. So I wanted to throw that in as well, Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. Okay, next slide. So indigenous knowledge. Say that 75% of all medications derive from indigenous knowledge, herbs, plants, trees, flowers, etc. But anti-cancer medication and treatment for cancer derive from the periwinkle and the yew. Some of those are in the Northwest and Northeast. Anti-malaria medication derived from wormwood and sagewort. They also utilize those from indigenous peoples. I think it was Asian countries. Pain medication derived from white willow bark. But there are many different medications and knowledge and stuff like that that comes from indigenous knowledge of peoples.
Go ahead.
Okay, next slide, please. So we get into a little bit about like with the raising the flag and stuff like that to remember, you know, the different things that natives have contributed to society and stuff like that, even the world, is Native American guerrilla warfare. It would have come primarily from our hunting practices. Stalking prey takes patience and alertness. You know, all that's around. Like if you go out hunting and you're stalking, you have to be very quiet. And sometimes even moving with others, you know, to push game or something like that in a certain direction, you know, takes some amount of precision and teamwork and things like that. Also remembering, you know, wind carries a sense. And watch the prints left behind, you know, setting up a weight game, or much like ambushes, being able to shoot, like, you know, it takes precision, like in snipers. So a lot of times in history, we look at those, and like even some of the first, when people first came over, they had seen that, and they looked at Native American warfare as not very good. But later on, it became to known that it was far better than marching up to one another and then taking volleys at each other. To build forces such as the Rangers. Later on came the Scouts and things like that. From the Scouts, moved on to the Special Forces, which is today. When I was in Fort Bragg, I was working in this Special Forces office for a bit. And I got to read through a lot of their material, look at that. They had all this material on the wall, and they gave a lot of credit to Native Americans. And that was, it really made, and it really sunk in that that feeling of, you know, why so many of the different units wanted Native Americans in their units. Because I know when I first got there, there was a guy, he always got to pick first, and of course, he picked me, and he said, "Well, are you a Native American?" I said, "Yes." And then right, because you're on my team. So, you know, it kind of moved on from there. But there were so many kind of beliefs too. It's like whether we tell the future or see what the weather changes are and stuff like that. But of course, down there, I never really had much faith in the weather people down there anyway. So. That was North Carolina. So they were always seemed to be exactly backwards. So said it's 70% rain, I would say, nah, it's today. They're more like 30. So I just, you know, even looking at movies, there were those who had grown up shooting and hunting from childhood, just as Apache learned to fight with knives. And both of those are utilized in the military. The Apache fighting techniques are utilized in the special ops and things like that.
Yeah. It seems often that in the process of colonization and becoming more acculturated to the Euro-American ways, that most Native families have moved away from the very indigenous tribal ways, native ways of preparing for life, and that and the mindset of all Native individuals historically has been that we are here to protect each other, regardless of whether you're a male or female, and that process of that value, the values that come from knowing that we're here to protect each other, bring with it a lot of responsibilities and roles that oftentimes overlap. One of the misconceptions, and this comes from a Euro-American misconception, so males are the fighters and females aren't. That was not the case. In almost all societies, females and males did things together, and had roles that complemented each other that way. I know for my people, our young women are taught that their role as their role shifts when they become a mother. As a woman and as a mother, the role shifts, and the shifting occurs to where they are the warriors, the ladies, the people who are responsible for what happens in the home, and they're given tools that way. And this is really honed in within the coming of age ceremonies that we have when young women come of age to be young girls come of age to be women, and that teaching really has been a lot better emphasized, I think. And tools they have are basically the same different kind of tools, but they're there to ward off the harm that comes from hunger, the harm that comes from violence, family violence, the harm that come from what men bring in because of the rougher kinds of circumstances or traumas that sometimes men can encounter. And with that is learning to be patient and alert to what happens not only in the home but outside of the home, because that's what the responsibility is for. Men, on the other hand, historically, and reservations changed this. Being interned and confined to reservations changed this, but men were out and about all the time. If they weren't out hunting for game, big game, they were out trading with other tribes. And that meant sometimes being away for weeks, if not months, to trade for things that were of value to the tribal community and to the family community. And with the advent of reservations and internment, that process of trading extensively got severely disrupted. So now we think that men's roles are the certain way which matches more in line with the nuclear family system that the Euro-Americans brought in. And so I think we have a lot of discussion to make as we go into topics like Native American appreciation, culture, and history on how Native culture and societies have really been changed over the 500 years of acculturation and assimilation. Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is part of that we were talking about before, is approximately 60% of all cancer medications, 75% of all the anti-infectious medications, and more commonly, the 61% of all new medications worldwide have come from plant-based materials known and used by indigenous peoples of the world. And I thought this was really good to add in there because, with natives, a lot of times what happens is, especially here, is that we talk to doctors and they said, what else are you taking or things like that? But they don't always realize that some of the medications that people are utilizing, we have other knowledge of utilizing herbs and things like that, ceremonies to be able to help ourselves as well. And sometimes they're kind of saying, well, I don't think you should use that because it's not tested. But, a lot of times with medicines and things like that, we've been using it for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. But so sometimes where these medications come from is also very important because new medicines are being found all the time within tribes because there are still medicine peoples, there are still people fasting and praying and things for cures or things to come. And sometimes that knowledge is given to these people to be able to help others. It's always what passed along with families down the line and generations and generations. Mm-hmm. They are finding them even today in ceremonies and in prayer and things like that.
Mm-hmm. One of the aspects of Indigenous knowledge that really captures my imagination is an example of what the graphic shows, we see a person holding sweetgrass or smudging. And one of the very indigenous ways of knowing and practice is the practice of smudging. And I'm saying indigenous because I'm just thinking of that globally from a worldwide perspective. The act of blessing or putting smoke on yourself is practiced across many cultures across the world, and such that it is highly valued in many indigenous societies in Africa, Asia, Europe, and here in the Americas. And I always find it interesting how the practice of burning a plant and putting the smoke of it on ourselves and blessing ourselves is one of those practices that is really a worldwide thing and not just specific to Native Americans. And I think the reason why smudging from a Native American approach using sweetgrass, sage, and stuff really resonates with a lot of non-Native Americans as a way of healing, because we know through scientific inquiry and studies that when we have peace of mind, we're in better health, not only mentally, but physically and emotionally. And I believe that that's the reason why across all cultures worldwide, that practice was used extensively as a way to give peace of mind to ourselves and ensure that that the blessings that we offered, whatever we call the Creator, was attended to. So thank you for that.
Okay, next slide, please.
Mhm.
Okay, so this slide is kind of comes from part of what is written kind of in history, but also looking at our medicines and spiritual ways. It's those are things that it's part of our culture. It's part of our beliefs and practices. It's a part of our heritage, and it's part of who we are. So a lot of times when we're looking at peoples, we also need to remember their own beliefs. And different tribes, they have their own beliefs, they have their own practices, they have their own ceremonies. One thing about like with ceremonies, even though they all look different, sometimes they're doing exactly the same things that other ceremonies are doing.
We understand that there's historical knowledge that we carry with us from our ancestors. This applies to all people, not only Native Americans, but with Europeans, Asians, and Africans. We all have historical knowledge. And one of the things that really intrigues me, and I alluded to this earlier in my discussion about smudging, is that the practice of going into a heated room, whether it was something that was done, carried out in a lot of cultural systems in the world. We're aware, for example, that the saunas, which comes out of the European lands, were used for the same kind of purpose as many of our tribes do, and used for cleansing our body, but also cleansing our mind and relaxing our bodies so that our neurotransmitters could work a certain way, so that our glands could begin to function a certain way, so that we wouldn't be as impacted by stress and trauma as we now are today. And I believe that because many of our cultures have moved away from the practice of a sauna or sweat lodge, that we're beginning to see a lot of these traumatic responses that are more severe than ever before. And But my point here is that the act of going into a heated room to 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 relax and to decompress is something that is not is something that was known outside of native country. As they do these archaeological digs in many of the European, Asian lands pre-colonization, they're becoming to realize that these ways were very synonymous to what we see here in native country. Thank you.
Yeah, that reminds me of part of healing is actually part of owning that healing. You have to be able to let things go too. You can't hold on to it. And part of that kind of comes from other teachings and things like that about, it's like saying how somebody might say they're sick. Usually, it's very common how people would use the word, I am this or I am that, but in reality, you should only use those words in a positive context, because then you're creating that and you're not creating something negative. So you would say, I am healing, I am well, I am good, and not saying it in a negative connotation. So that's something very important, part of healing and using medicines is you must believe in it. Next slide. Okay, so we look at traditional medicines and spirituality because they go hand in hand. Traditional medicine is comprised of pretty much everything we do. It's in our breath, it's in our body, our spirit, in everything around us, the air we breathe, the trees, the stones, plants, animals, pretty much like in everything like that, even nature, like the storms and whatever it might be. I mean, even with snow, they say it's part of the creator. It's part of that air, it's part of that breath, it's part of water and moisture and all these different things. There's so much to be able to look at when you're looking at deeper meanings and deeper things within a lot of the medicine and spiritual beliefs and traditional knowledge, because they're like, even like here, I know we talk about the first man of the day walking. He walks this earth over and over again. And in the early morning, he'll start coming. And then he brings that light along and it goes around and around, it keeps doing this. It brings in the breath of the creator. And sometimes when medicines and the creator's going over high noon, those are times when to really pray and things, to offerings and things like that. There are other things you can use to heal that way too, but like even when they talk about like ghosts or anything like that, there's a way to capture them and place them up. So when the creator goes through, they'll take them with them. There's so many different practices and beliefs and all these things that go hand in hand in doing those kind of works. But spirituality is pretty much the basis of all beliefs and practices, everything within us, because those things were given to us by the creator. And a lot of times the strongest part that we can do is that connection with the creator. That's where people begin to receive medicines and gifts and things like that to be able to help the people. Ray, you have anything?
No, I really appreciate what you're saying, and I think you hit the nail right on the nail head, I believe you say. But thank you. Now go ahead.
Okay, next slide. Like even medicines, like I was talking about today, when we're going to see doctors or anything, we need to remember that a lot of the tribal peoples are still utilizing these in many different forms. So sometimes they might make teas out of them, something that helps them. And they know that like sage and certain things can get rid of bacteria and things in the air. But there's so many more different ways to be able to utilize those things, and not just in smudging, but remembering that they might make certain teas, and sometimes even in mixing medicines, there can't always even be made together. Sometimes they have to be made separately and then added together to be able to work. But big thing is remembering that they're still utilized today.
Mhm, mhm. I think I'd like to interject here that medicines were oftentimes specific to regions or within communities or tribes. But many of the medicines that were developed and the healing practices that came with them, the ceremonies, what they call ceremonies, were very often shared across tribal communities. It was very common for a member of a tribal community here to go to another tribal community over here to get blessings, prayers, or a healing practice done, and vice versa. And so there was a lot of these ways were shared that way. But the medicines that we use, bear root, for example, is a good example. Osha, they call it, I think, is exists extensively across many parts of our country. There are some people who use bear root as a way to smudge and cleanse themselves, but it's also a very strong antibacterial herb in and of itself. And so the process of boiling it and drinking a tea or cleansing the bark and chewing on the root was very common as a way to sustain health. And I'm using that as an example of how that one particular plant, for example, was applied across many tribes along the west coast and on into the hill lands like the Rockies, where because bear root grows in higher elevations. And so and cedar, for example, is used in many tribes and the different forms that it comes in. But I wanted to share that once again, that our relationships across communities were very extensive, not only for food and trading, but also just a sharing of spiritual practices and medicines. Thank you.
Yeah, to kind of reiterate what Ray is kind of saying, example of people utilizing medicines from different areas, the same that might not even come from around their own area, and the knowledge of it is sometimes you need a certain kind of medicine people sometimes to be able to heal certain things. Like maybe there's those who work with cancer. There are those who work with other kind of illnesses and things like that. So you have to go to them. And sometimes then they give you that knowledge and stuff like that you can take back to help people. But sometimes like medicine people might meet each other, and to be able to, share what they can. Because sometimes some are not able to share everything. So.
Yeah, I'll use this other example. Among my people, abalone, I saw an abalone shell in one of the previous slides, is highly valued among my people. And we're pretty much a high plateau people. We live in the Four Corners area, and the ocean is probably 600 miles from us, Navajo people. But we knew and used and valued abalone in a really high degree. And because and once again, I'm sharing this information as an example of how medicines and our cultural ways spread across the Southwest. I read a story the other day where the Yaqui people, who are considered in the Mexican part of the Southwest, had lands up north, and they had trading routes all the way up into the New England area and way down into the South American area. My people, we value, in our ways, we value feathers from colored feathers, like basically from the South. But so in our Native American heritage time, I think this gives us opportunity to reflect on the histories that we have shared a lot together, that carried our ancestors through real turbulent times, but can also carry us through these turbulent times that we're having with the pandemic, and how we can take some of the stories that Sean is sharing and some of the knowledge that we're offering here today as a way to understand that it's okay to go, if you're an inland people, to go to the coast and feel comfortable there, because that's how your ancestors did it also. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Next slide, please. Here's where we talk a little bit about Smud. Ray has covered a lot of these things. The thing about it is it helps to negate negative energies. It helps to protect you. It helps with cleansing, healing. Of course, there's a different teas, of course, but there are numerous medicines used to smudge, including, the 4 directional medicines that people many times use a day. And one thing about it too, that's very common, like what Ray was talking about, the abalone shells, is that when smudging and utilizing these, you're also bringing in balance. It brings water and fire together. So a lot of times within many of the different practices, there is a sense of balance within nature and utilizing these kind of things. And sometimes there are even those where they have a man and woman to be able to balance things out together. And a lot of times you need the female and male energies to be able to help one another. That's why you like pick certain kind of plants and stuff like that. Some are known to be female medicines. Some are known as male medicines. Taking a lot of these things into account really helps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of times we see the big drum here, like within powwows and things like that. But looking at history and stuff like that, some of the big drum actually came from the ceremonies of the big drum ceremonies. But there's also, they can be used as instruments. Ray, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'd like to share that. See, get into the right thing here. The when many people think of Native American instruments, musical instruments, they think of the drums only, but a thing that is not as well appreciated and more oftentimes lost due to the last 500 years is that many tribes still today include flutes and whistles. There are a whole variety of flutes and whistles that were created across all of Native country, just like across the world. Across the world, all cultures created flutes and whistles. I've seen archaeological findings that go back 100,000 years, where they're finding evidence of flutes and whistles on some of the archaeological digs that they're coming across in other parts of the world. And so that has been a real common thread with all people across the world, I think. But with our people in particular, flutes and whistles continue to have a major role. And one of the underappreciated aspects of Native American history is that a lot of tribal communities created stringed instruments to pluck and also to run a bow across, and as part of instrumentation. And the other part of it, instrumentation or musical instruments that is underappreciated is the process of making gourds to rattle, which are very common within many of the ceremonies that are within tribal communities. I know with my people, we use gourds and some of the healing ceremonies that we have. But one of the major healing activities that we have in Native country are the gourd dances, where gourds are used to celebrate being a warrior, and also to acknowledge the process of healing ourselves in that way. So this is an aspect of instrumentation that we thought would be good to bring up as we go into Native American Appreciation Month, is that we value our instruments and use them extensively. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Next slide, please.
Related to instrumentation, whenever a people plays instruments, there are always going to be vocalizing of sound with the instrumentation, and we know that and singing across all cultures occur in two broad areas. There are those songs that are ceremonial, spiritual, religious, that way, like Christian hymns. Then there are those songs that are not that way. They're secular. They're more interpersonal. They're very public, out in the world kind of things. and they're in many societies, they have two different functions. The secular music and songs are done within certain settings, and the spiritual religious songs are done in church only, let's say, or church mainly. And very rarely do they enter overlap like this. And that's one of the distinctions between Native American culture, is that many of the secular songs that would be considered secular songs overlap into the spiritual ways that we have. And for me to say, for example, that you can't sing the song because it's sacred requires a lot more knowledge and detail than I would have. If a Native person takes time and opportunity to sing a song in public, and then they explain this is a spiritual song, and that's something to be accepted. Once again, because of internship, forced suppression of Native ways, many of the singing and songs, and especially the ceremonial songs, went underground. And one of the unfortunate misperceptions we have of Native people is that our ceremonial songs are too sacred to take out and share with others. That's not the way it had been. But because we became landlocked within the reservations, that sharing process basically went away. And one of the blessings that I see coming out in Native country today is a lot more sharing of those ceremonial songs across lands and across regions. The sweat lodge, for example, is done in a lot of different ways across Native country, and some of us are blessed to have been included in these different sweatlodge settings across the United States and be able to hear the songs that are going on in there. But also been able to be included in some of the more secular activities that happen, across Native country today, and a lot more openness around including not only other Native people, but also other non-Native people in some of these activities and some of these ways that we have in Native country, because that's one of the very Indigenous values that we have, is the value of sharing knowledge and sharing our gifts. Unfortunately, because of cultural appropriation that is harmful, that is used in a real harmful way by some people, we end up still being very careful about what we can share and what we cannot share. Among Navajo spiritual practices, for example, we have some songs that are very private to us. They're within very certain settings and very private to the healer and to the patient. On the other hand, we have some ceremonial songs that are a little more public. They can be sung outside of those very strict ceremonial settings, within families, let's say, which is a lot more common. On the other hand, the secular songs like the lullabies and stories and songs and stuff are very much out there on social media, especially. I get a kick out of watching Facebook and TikTok, for example. There are a whole lot of Native people putting out songs that are secular and showing how they're applied not only in dance but also in family gatherings, and some songs come close to being ceremonial. And the other thing I wanted to include in here is that among the Inuit in northern Alaska and Canada, the practice of throat singing exists. And again, one of my joys is watching and hearing the throat singing style that the Inuit people and other Alaska Natives up north have created and growing among them, and how that is different from throat singing the way it's done across the Bering Sea, for example, among Mongolians and other native people on the Russian side of the Arctic. So I wanted to acknowledge that throat singing as a musical style, as a way of singing, exists in Native country today. And if you ever get a chance to look up Inuit throat singing, it's a really eye-opening and very blessed way of doing it, and experiencing how that is done. And then if you get a chance to hear throat singing in the Mongolian style, you can see the variation that exists between the two. And I want to mention right now that if anyone in the audience has questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in chat so that we can respond to them and make sure that we include your questions as well in this discussion that we're having with each other. Go ahead, Sean.
Okay, next slide, please.
One of the areas that my brother Sean and I have a keen interest in is Native humor. In fact, we have such a keen interest in Native humor that we've done a couple of talks on this in other settings, and have included brothers and sisters from other Native lands into creating a really good bonding and understanding about how our humor sometimes has a uniqueness to it that is special, and our traditions are very deep in humor. Once again, I go to YouTube, and I joined TikTok like about 6 months ago, and Facebook, for example, and I get a really deep joy out of seeing how our humor is displayed in public by our young people and our elders. And sometimes that humor can be really biting, you know. And the disclosure here is that, yeah, and is that about a couple of weeks ago, I created a Facebook group called Native COVID Humor, a new group that some of us have put together, just celebrating our humor during these times of trauma within the pandemic. And I've been really pleased at the kinds of posts that members of the group are making to that Native COVID humor group that we have on Facebook. Our humor includes jokes and stories between tribes and communities. You know, we tease each other vigorously, heavily. And, you know, for example, I'd like to use this example because it's very clear cut. Is that among some tribes, the practice of consuming poor puppies is really significant. You know? Brings tears to my eyes whenever I just think about that. And my brother Sean is laughing because he knows how traumatic that is for me. But among my people, you know, that's a very strict no, we don't do that. On the other hand, there are some tribes, particularly tribes that have a hard time hunting, that don't kind of boot away from hunting and have to go to puppies to sustenance. They eat puppy, you know. And so we have this back and forth sometimes among puppy consuming tribes and non-puppy consuming tribes like Navajo, go back and forth about why they do that thing to the poor animals. Yeah. So that's an example of the kind of jokes that occur between tribes, and how we tease each other pretty rigorously. And Native societies, you know, we notice through psychological research, how and the mental health research is that the best way to ease tension, stress, anger, and all these other negative emotions that come upon us in quote unquote regular life, but even now during the pandemic, one of the best ways to deal with it is through humor and laughter. You know, you change your biochemical systems by laughter. You making your muscles move in an upward fashion instead of the other way. It's just really gratifying and helps others to be able to tease and laugh and share funny times, especially now. We're all going through some level of pandemic fatigue, you know, and I think more than ever, it's an important time to tease each other and share humor with each other, so that we can get through this uncertain time that we have. We don't know what that new normal is ever going to look like in a year, 2 years down the line, if ever. But nonetheless, you know, we have humor to go to. And I would ask my relatives who are in this session, if you're feeling uneasy about certain things, you know, go on social media and find places that display Native humor and enjoy them and join that conversation, the humorous conversations that occur. You know, and we have some very, very fine Native comedians in Native country who are very good at making us laugh. You know, and so I would encourage us to really look at this as a way to survive, let alone and begin to thrive again through these periods that we have. Sean's LOLing us. And the third thing about Native humor that is common to many societies, that there are moral teachings embedded within Native humor. A lot of our tribal ways have coyote as that shining example of how not to be humorous, but also being humorous at the same time, because the coyote's behavior has with it teachings about morality. and teachings of way to be, and that's how we have some commonality across our lands, not only as Native people, but also across other lands and across the world. So this is an important topic for me, and once again, a reason why I thought it'd be a good thing to do was to create a humor group around the pandemic. There are a lot of funny things going on, a lot of teasing going around COVID, and now I'm seeing a lot of things around that new variant that's out. That's really got me laughing these days. So, but thank you again, Sean. Go ahead and jump in, buddy.
Yeah, I think it's very important to remember humor. It's not to look at everything so seriously. And part of that is also within teachings of many of the tribes who have what they call sacred clowns, able to do things where others cannot. Like maybe at a funeral, they might laugh. In something that's very funny or going on, they might cry. They might be very serious when it shouldn't be serious, or do things that are just not appropriate at a time. But for them, it's okay, and people know that. They're there to teach you, and to teach you things like with opposites, and look at things a little bit differently, but also to look at oneself.
Yeah.
And that's where we really need to be able to look at, because sure, it's used in like even therapy, and spiritually, when you laugh, you are putting your body into a whole new kind of state of all this vibrations and energies going with your body. And like, I don't know, like let's say you went through some moment where you were very angry or something like that. So later on, you begin to laugh about something so hard that you might feel pains in your bodies, because sometimes that's when those things are coming out, and that those kind of negative energies are being pushed out of your bodies. It's also part of a healing.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I fully agree with you that if there's ever a time when we can share laughter, now's the time to do it. In particular, look for our relatives who are more seriously angry or more seriously stressed or under tension. And as Catherine Marin mentioned, find times to do that with not only friends and family, but also the clients that we work with that come to us for support. So thank you for that.
Next slide, please. So remembering that traditional beliefs are part of the culture, here's some things that might be some information. Is drums were not just utilized for today's commercialized powwows, but and also powwows have been going on for over 150 years. A lot of times those were meant to allow others to be able to see our culture in that kind of form. Some of these regalia people might have been using was like a long time ago. Those would have been medicines that people wore into battle, to avoid being harmed or hurt. It's just like in the military, it's like we might carry a medicine pouch or something like that with us to be able to keep us safe and protected. There's some of the dancing that goes on. You'll see younger single people dancing what they call the fancy dance, and they're really dancing. And some of that came from drawing prospective mates to themselves so that they can meet people. And but powwows used to be able to get tribes together, to get along, to make friendships, to make allies, to meet and other tribes and stuff like that in a peaceful way and things like that. But this is information that sometimes people don't always know. So if they look at certain powwows and see certain things going on, then they might be able to look at that and see different practices.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me share, Sean, that there are 570 plus Native communities in the just the United States alone. And we tend to forget that there are millions and millions of Indigenous Native people south of the border. And the United States has within our boundaries Native practices from many of those Indigenous communities south of the border. And I think it's valuable to appreciate that when we talk about Native Heritage Month. I'm reminded, and this is one of the reasons why I talk about trading, sharing in our historical societies, historical past experiences, is that we're seeing deer dancing, for example, coming back into the Southwest the way it had been before that artificial boundary was set up between two Euro-American countries. And I really appreciate that. You know, and not only that, but seeing Tohono O'odham people who some of whom are separated by the artificial boundary begin to share their cultural ways across that artificial border. And the last thing I want to say is that because we have so many different Native cultures in the United States, a heck of a lot more than the 570 federally recognized tribes. We probably have over 1,000 different Native cultures in the United States. And it's kind of a big thing to kind of put into our mind framework and think about, but also to accept that we have literally 1,000 different Native cultures in the United States. And with that many different Native cultures in the United States, there are going to be some real significant differences between them, you know? And so how we describe a certain Native practice is likely not going to be similar or practiced in the same kind of way by another Native culture. And that's an important thing to remember. If someone asks me, are Native people like this? I really have to think about that from a Navajo perspective, but also say that is probably not true for other people. You know, I see the four colors that are described in the four quadrants, for example, as I'll use that as an example. The Native quadrants, the Navajo quadrants are quite different. Our colors are different. In Navajo culture, to the east, we have white. To the south, we have blue. To the west, we have yellow. And to the north, we have black. Those are our four primary colors in the Navajo way. And I'm using that as an example of how distinct some of our ways can be from each other. The practice of a nipi and across some of the tribes is quite a bit different from the practice of sweat the way we do it here on Navajo land. We use adobe huts for our sweat. And the other thing we do on Navajo that is different from the way many tribes do is we don't put water on our rocks. Our sweats are dry. And I'm using these two examples as a way to describe what I'm trying to say is that we as natives can't be put into one small basket and bowl and say, this is how you are. There's so much variation among us that we always have to keep an open mind about each other and with our non-native relatives and friends also to have an open mind when you think about Native people across the United States. And the other thing is because of movement, vertically the way it happened before, we're seeing a lot more of the South American and Central American and Mexican native cultures coming in, and the thing to know about there are is that the native people from Mexico, South America, and Central America far outnumber native people in the United States, Canada, and Alaska. They outnumber us by millions. And that's one of the other unappreciated things that I think exists in the world today, that we tend to continue to isolate ourselves to thinking that we're the only native people in the lands. No, there are hundreds of millions of others in this hemisphere that are as vibrant and strong about their practices in ways that we ever can be. So I wanted to interject that at this time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. Next slide, please. So like we talked about before, is like drums have also been used in ceremonies. A lot of times, even before the powwows, there were many beliefs, knowledge of various drums, you know, the bells, arrowheads, staffs by medicine peoples, their symbols or words of power. Depending upon the power of each, there's a difference on where they're utilized and how they're used. Pretty much anyone can powwow today, but the ability to be able to work with medicines and healing and stuff like that sometimes depends upon the gifts that people are given. But also remembering, it's like there are teachings where drums have to be built like certain ways as well. Like, since if it's some of these bigger drums, they might use the whole hide of an animal, using the back as the top and the belly as the bottom, facing the same direction. And maybe sometimes they have to be in that direction to be able to be utilized. So, you know, it's and even like beating a drum, like lightning won't fight against each other, and leather, they don't hurt each other. Stones won't hurt each other, like spiritually and things like that. So sometimes it's like, that's why they utilize a wrap on there, because then it's on the drums, because then you're not hurting it. Like if you beat an animal with a stick or something like that. So a lot of times they're wrapped so you won't harm. It's like different teachings. You don't use metal on stone, things like that. There's so many different practices and knowledge and stuff to be able to think of when you're doing these things. Okay, next slide, please. This is just we want to share it with a longhouse from the Oneida tribes and stuff like that. I know ours here is more, we'd use willows and it kind of comes up and around. But when you think about throughout many different tribes, what is their name for houses? What is their name for a home? Because many people would say, well, natives, they live in teepees, but no, not all tribes utilize teepees. So when you think about it, it's like, how many different names can you think of the different tribes where they have as a home? Okay, next slide, please. So we get into Native warriors and stuff like that, and Native veterans, Native warriors. From history, we looked at the Indian Scouting Service. Of course, that came after the Rangers, but they were both derived utilizing Native warfare style, and what has now become kind of moved on, and what has become the Special Forces. Okay, next slide. Native warrior practices, much as what is used now in military tactics, came from the guerrilla warfare of natives. Long time ago, they would kind of march up against, like I said, one-on-one, the red line, and take volleys at each other. But this is something that was very common. What they would say is that the natives, they approached like foxes, fought like lions, and disappeared like birds. So a lot of times they weren't always seen, or they were just seen very briefly and take off. A lot of kind of different military tactics utilize the same things, like the snipers, ambushes, just a lot of different things. It's pretty neat when you look at the history of those things. Okay, next. Okay, go ahead, Ray. Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, while you're speaking, Sean, I was reflecting on how the knowledge, skills, and abilities of being a protector for males and females began at an early age, and physical endurance and and well-being were very much built into our native systems, and taught that way, and encouraged. And one of the harms that has come from the Euro-American educational system is a movement from that, and not as well valued as within traditional Native societies, and I'm a boarding school student, for example, and the boarding school I went to, from a real young age, we were taught fitness, and we were taught to be alert and to take care of ourselves, and we're encouraged to spend time running around in the mountains. We're taught those things, which was which was good, because when I got into the military, I was already able to do that. I was able to handle the runs, and I was able to endure some of the physical hardships that they try to put you through in boot camp. And with the other Navajos that I was in basic training with, we'd sometimes tease each other that it was like being in second grade, learning to do the things of basic training that non-Navajo people would complain and sometimes cry about. And so I think that we were brought up more closely in line with how traditional ways were from the boarding school experience that we had, and so I wanted to interject that here. Thank you.
Yeah, the chows were a lot like we're in boarding school.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Next slide, please. So we talk about female Native veterans. So it's like Ray has already emphasized this point, is females have been fighting alongside the males as a pretty long time. It goes back, back even like the 1700s. There was a woman that was fighting alongside her husband, and during the time when he was reloading, he had hurt his arm, but she kept reloading for him so that he could keep shooting. So that was pretty interesting. Yeah.
Well, in contemporary military society, the military system that's designed, about 13% of active duty people are female. And so this gender thing that the Euro-American system gets caught up in makes that distinction. And it's really, really unfortunate, because once again, go back to the Navajo way of thinking, and which is not that far off from many of the traditional indigenous ways, is acknowledging that women have warrior roles just as clearly and as strongly as men do. Sometimes it has a different way of practicing, but nonetheless that exists. and across all tribes, particularly during the conflicts that tribes had with the United States government, where warfare was very pronounced. Across all tribal systems, there are a lot of examples of women taking up arms along with the men and participating in the conflicts that happened, and not being looked upon in any other way other than respectfully. And so respect is built into our systems, the native systems traditionally. And I find it really intriguing how in the world we have today, we have to, in contemporary Euro-American society, there seems to be this anxiety around having to remind each other that women can be warriors too. Well, heck, in traditional ways, it's taken for granted, you know? And that's where I think these systems, ways of being, the indigenous ways of being, the non-indigenous ways of being begin to have some distinction and separation. So I wanted to interject that here. Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please.
Mhm.
Yeah, we wanted to just in honor of all the Native soldiers and warriors. So when we say soldiers and warriors, we're not just talking about males, but also females.
Mhm. Good. So we have some opportunity for comments or questions from anybody. If you can do that, please give us your thoughts. Thank you, Courtney, for your very kind words. And there have been other comments like that earlier on. I want to acknowledge Sean and all the tremendously hard work he put into preparing this presentation for us. Sean, you're a great man in my eyes, and I love you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. I know we have David Natsway on here.
Mhm.
He's still on. A lot of our people in their advisory council, some of our trainers and consultants have all served in the military. So we're pretty proud of them all.
Mhm.
So if there's any soldiers out there, veterans or anything, thank you.
Yeah. And here you have our contact information for Sean and myself. And I know I'm speaking for Sean here, but we're very open to follow-up comments or questions after these sessions. So feel free to email us any questions you have or thoughts down the line. And if I don't know an answer to a question that you send me, I'll definitely get a hold of Sean or some of the other folks that we know of to get clarity on the question that you have. But this information is here for you to maintain connection with us with down the line. Roy, thank you very much too, brother, for joining us and sharing your time with us. Guyana, Martha, I'm not sure what part of Alaska you're from, but your words look Yupik to me. I have some experience with Yupik Chupik people in my work career. So Guyana, Chepnik for your kind words. I'm gonna share something here before we close. Particularly with Martha, who's looks like might be Yupik, but I'm glad I survived all the forced fish feeding that the Yupik Chupi people and also the Athabascan tried to put on me. It was like trying to be forced fed dog meat, but we do eat fish sometimes. And one of the good things about the Yupik Chupik and Athabascan and Southwest Alaska is that they're very good about gifting. And I think when they found out that this Navajo man didn't eat a lot of fish, they gifted me a whole bunch of fish and overwhelmed me. So that was one of the blessings of being in the Yukon Kuskokwim area for several years. Thank you. Yeah, Martha, you guys are very mischievous people. I learned that. So, anything else, Sean?
I think so. Just thank you all for being here and listening. It's very good to have you all. Ooh.
Moose meat, Josh. One of the weird things going on today in Navajo country is that we have a moose that wandered onto our lands a couple of weeks ago, and so we have a wandering moose on Navajo land, and we haven't seen moose down here in a long time. So some of the younger Navajos are discombobulated. They don't know what to do with this moose that wandered into Navajo country. Elders are saying, leave it alone, leave it alone. You know, maybe other moose will follow. And then we'll have moose back in our diet again.
Well, if you don't have a moose season, it's open season.
Yeah, so I'm afraid that moose is going to get taken out pretty soon because I see a lot of Navajos wanting to move away from the sheep diet back to moose. So, but the last story I read was that this particular moose that's on Navajo lands begun hanging out with horses for some reason, wild horses. So I guess it's feeling more protected by that. So we're getting a lot of Navajo joking around this lone moose that's on our lands, and we're wondering which tribe chased it down here. So
Maybe you
if you have
think
any
they're
ideas
a
on-
bunch of female mooses or something. Huh?
maybe it's mistaken the horses for moose. I don't know.
Yeah. They get big like Clydesdales.
They're huge. Yeah. So that's my moose story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
What do you call more than one moose then?
Meese.
All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. Good to have you. Have a great rest of your day and week and the rest of the month too, I guess.
Thanks, everyone.